There's a big misconception that pelvic floor training is only for women. Of course, both men and women have pelvic floors, but it's a bit more taboo to talk about it when it comes to men, because a lot of the discussion is about postpartum, incontinence, and other type of pelvic floor dysfunction. But men also have pelvic floor issues. And in this video, we're going to be talking about how we can manipulate training, specifically plyometric and strength exercises, to train the pelvic floor a bit more effectively for both men and women. Hi, I'm Alex Zephyr, founder of Resilient Training Rehab, and I've helped thousands of coaches and practitioners get better and more consistent results with their clients. Let's get into it. So previously I made a video about pelvic floor anatomy and how it works, and so let's just refresh a little bit of the internal anatomy as it relates to how the pelvis is positioned and how the rib cage. So the pelvic floor and the diaphragm stack on top of each other. So we've got the diaphragm around the lower part of the rib cage, and we've got the pelvic floor that attaches from the back part of the sacrum, think of the coccyx, and attaches to the front part of the pubis symphysis. That pelvic floor occupies the bottom part of the pelvis. So when I breathe in, the diaphragm pushes the organs down into the pelvis. And so now the pelvis has to open up to accept that. When that happens, the pelvic floor has to descend. So I gave this analogy before, it's like throwing a baseball. So it's like a catch and throw between the thoracic diaphragm and the pelvic floor. So as I breathe in, I'm throwing the guts down, and so now the pelvic floor has to catch it. When I exhale, now the pelvis starts to compress laterally. The pelvic floor then lifts up, because as I bring the two top parts together, then the bottom part opens, which then creates tension in the pelvic floor. That then lifts the organs up, and now the thoracic diaphragm's catching it. And so if we think of the pelvic floor as this kind of trampoline, when I breathe in, it has to catch. So think of like I'm jumping and landing into the trampoline, and how my body then descends. And then as I exhale, it springs back up. So it shoots everything back up towards the head. And so if we can then manipulate that position by understanding that when I inhale, which is more external rotation, and when I exhale, it's more internal rotation, I'm going to be able to manipulate the pelvic floor tension, and I'm going to be able to manipulate the joint range of motion. So whenever I'm thinking about exercises, and in this case we're talking about plyometric exercises, I'm thinking about how I can create space, how I can accept force, how I can produce force, and then how I can accept and produce force repeatedly. So it's kind of like my four-phase system of how to create that kind of position and create the force that I want. And so we're going to break it down into creating space and force absorption at the same time. So if we think about somebody who's really stiff, so their pelvis is squeezed in the back, so think of somebody who's always squeezing their glutes, and so their pelvic floor is descended, but because the pelvis is going forward, or I'm arching the lower back and dumping the pelvis forward, they're also going to have a little bit more stiffness. So it's like a saggy pelvic floor that then gets pretty stiff because the muscles on the outside start to contract and squeeze the pelvis. And so with these people, they're going to be missing a lot of hip flexion. They're not going to be able to get deep into squatty positions. They're not going to be able to touch their toes very well. So initially what we have to do is restrict the amount of hip flexion we give them. And we have to start to get them to go into a position where the back part of the pelvis and the pelvic floor can start to relax a little bit. So we're going to try to create a little bit more space in the back of the hip initially. And then as we go on, we're going to start to talk about other compensations. So this first exercise is meant to create space in the back and reduce tension in the pelvic floor. Okay, so this first exercise, we're gonna have a bit of a higher box. So as you can see, if I sit down, I'm not at 9 degrees of hip flexion, I'm slightly above. I also like to elevate the heels in this case with a wider stance. So think of the stance as being a little bit more shoulder width apart or a bit wider. The reason for that is if I have this really squeezed pelvis, or the back part of my pelvis is very compressed, then my sockets are going to start to turn outwards. So if I go too narrow, then my knees are going to start to cave in, or they're going to bow out. So having that distance, that wider space, is going to be a little bit less tension or create a little bit less tension in the hips. And so I can then decompress the backside of the pelvis. What I'm then gonna do, because I want to rapidly reduce the tension, I'm going to create an exercise that causes my body to have to decelerate something. So I'm gonna take a medicine ball. I'm gonna keep the weight through my heels because the heel lifts are gonna try to push me towards my toes. So I'm gonna sit back into my heels. I'm then gonna throw the ball up as I breathe out. And then as I breathe in, I'm gonna catch the ball. So I'm trying to coordinate the catch with me sitting. So I don't want to catch it and then sit. I want it to drop underneath the ball and catch it as soon as I land. Again, when I breathe in at the bottom, that's going to help me descend that pelvic floor. And by catching the ball, it causes me to have to recreate tension in a better space. So if I'm tense here all the time, squeezing my glutes, I'm gonna maintain that pressure in the back part of the pelvis. But if I go into a squat position, especially just above 90 degrees, I'm gonna open up the back part of the hip, but by catching the ball, I'm also going to reinforce a better pelvic position. So for the second exercise, we're now gonna teach the body how to produce force. So when we produce force, that is now gonna create more of this internal rotation of the pelvis. So if I internally rotate the pelvis, so I laterally squeeze the pelvis, then this sacrum is going to start to an action called nutation, which is the tailbone's basically moving away from the sit bones. When that happens, this is great for being able to touch your toes, so deadlift positions, hinging positions, but it's also internal rotation of the hips. So somebody who is very floppy, has a lot of mobility, a lot of external rotation, not a lot of internal rotation, this next variation is gonna be very effective because what I'm gonna be doing with this seated box jump is I'm gonna be starting at 90 degrees of hip flexion. I'm also not using momentum, so it's a non-counter movement jump. So what that means is a counter movement jump is when I descend and then I ascend. This is, I'm starting in a position where I'm stationary. So now I have to build up a lot of pressure and create a lot of tension in the tissues and use more muscle to propel myself up, to break inertia or break that stationary movement. So that's gonna require a lot more force production and more internal rotation of the pelvis. Again, for somebody who doesn't have a lot of internal rotation. So in order to execute this, what we're gonna do is we're gonna sit on the box and I want you to feel your sit bones on the box. So I don't want you to be leaned forward too much. I don't want you to slouch back. I want you to pretend like you're pushing tall through your sit bones. You're also gonna drive pressure through your heels. You're gonna swing your arms back, and then you're gonna push through the ground and jump up as you breathe out. And then you're gonna land back into that squat position. Breathe in, touch the box. And essentially what we're doing is, again, we're not going too much on our toes. Even if you have to reposition each set where you're finding those sit bones getting tall, swinging the arms back, which then shifts the weight back into your heels and into your sit bones. And then you're gonna jump and then land again, okay? And so I like to include this in the warm-up. I like to include this as part of the strength session. Sometimes I'll even include it at the end part of the strength session, just depending on what the goal is. So for the last phase, we're gonna be producing and accepting force. So we're alternating between the two repeatedly. And so this is for somebody who we have the ability to access a certain amount of range of motion, so a good amount of range of motion created by the other two exercises, and we've taught our body how to internally rotate the hips. I wouldn't necessarily do this with somebody who doesn't have the ability to internally rotate or externally rotate the hips. This is going to be for somebody who has access to space, and we can start to use the different qualities interchangeably. So what we're going to do is a lateral lunge quick drop to rebound. So I'm going to use this ramp because as my foot gets on the ramp, I'm able to load into it and teach my body how to push off. Because as I land, it's going to put me more on the inside edge of the foot, but momentum is going to try to push me on the outside edge. which is then going to prepare me to be in a position to extend my hip. If my left side's closest to the wedge, I'm gonna grab the kettlebell initially with my left hand. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna crouch down, so I've got the weight on this outside leg. I'm gonna push myself over to the left, catch, push off the left, come back. And so I'm trying to do this repeatedly, where I'm breathing in as I land, breathing out as I come off. So I'm gonna breathe in now, push off the left leg, push off the left, now pushing off the right, and we're gonna alternate. And this is a great way to accept force while producing it. And when you're doing this, you do this on both sides, because I want to teach your body how to be able to accept force and produce force. Sometimes when you have somebody who has more of this asymmetrical pelvis, maybe we do it in the warm-up just on the one side. It's all depending on what the goal is and who the person is. So it's important to understand that pelvic floor training can be both for men and women, and it's not a taboo subject, but it's something that we can incorporate with our understanding of how the body moves. Joint range of motion, pelvic position is all going to impact this. And we can pick specific exercises that allow us to restore that trampoline's ability to accept force, produce force, and then do it interchangeably. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, save, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.